Tonight, 10 small observations about the Alberta independence movement. It's February 10th, and this is the Ezra Levant Show.
Shame on you, you censorious thug.
Oh, hi, everybody. I was born and raised in Alberta. My father's an Albertan, actually goes back to 1903 when my family first came there. That's actually before it was a province. 1903 in a place like the United Kingdom or France is a blink of an eye. It's very modern, but 1903 in the prairies is pretty ancient. And the thing is, the history of Alberta, which I studied growing up, both in school and just in informal readings, is one of inequality. The province of Alberta was born unequal. It didn't have the same natural resource rights as eastern provinces. It was born weak on purpose. There was the contemplated idea of a super province called Buffalo, if you can believe it. Look it up. That had both Alberta and Saskatchewan joined. It was cut in half to make sure it didn't get too powerful. But of course, the two provinces are best friends. There's a lot of things about Alberta's history that keep echoing over time. For example, Justin Trudeau's father, Pierre Trudeau, raiding the oil wealth there in the National Energy Program, which then, of course, came back with Justin Trudeau's own carbon tax. And now with Mark Carney demanding all sorts of payoffs and commissions of sorts, carbon capture here, carbon tax there, before Albertans are allowed to work for a living. No other industry in the country has to pay off collateral interests before they have the right to do, lumber or fish or coal. Coal maybe a little bit, but only Alberta has to pay a kind of fee in political favors before it's allowed to exploit its own resources. These things add up over the course of time. But I live in Ontario now. I used to say I'm an exile in Toronto. You can only say that for so long before you are an Ontarian. I feel, though, a great kinship with Alberta, and I visit it all the time. We have a presence in Alberta, our chief reporter up there, Sheila Gunn-Reid, and others as well. And I feel like I'm keeping my ear to the ground on this independence movement very closely. It's something that I followed growing up, and I followed Preston Manning's attempted antidote to separatism. Remember that Preston Manning's first motto for the Reform Party was, "The West wants in." It was a complete rebuttal to the West wants out, the Western Canada concept, and other separatist movements that flourished in response to Pierre Trudeau's attack on the West. Preston Manning, in his own way, saved Canada. Now, you'll never hear a thank you from Ontario and Quebec. They have nothing but hatred for him. But he is the one who took all that energy and said, hey, guys, let's try and reform the country, not abandon it. Well, I was part of that in a very small way. I was Preston Manning's assistant for a couple of years in Parliament, and I was a youth organizer, and I was thrilled with the energy in Alberta, but I soon came to the conclusion that everyone else in Alberta has always concluded, which is the numbers just aren't there. When you are 10% of the population, even a couple percent more in our structure, you just get the short end of the stick every time. There is not the same protection for oil-rich places in Canada as, let's say, Texas. It would be unthinkable that the federal government would raid Texas in the manner that the federal government has raided Alberta. These are some of the things on my mind, but I'd like to share with you 10 thoughts. They're not deep thoughts, they're not intricate thoughts, but they're just sort of some things I've observed over the debate. And I say this as an Ontarian who loves Alberta and someone who thinks that Alberta has actually been hard done by in its own way. You might laugh at that. Alberta is the wealthiest place in Canada. It's very successful despite the attacks on it, but it's a combination of what it has not been able to do and how it has been deliberately disrespected over the generations. These are some of the things on my mind. So let me start with my first point, which is that the Alberta independence movement is not actually anti-Canadian, and it's definitely not anti-patriotic. In fact, I bet that in Alberta, most military veterans, let alone serving military, and most police vets are for it. And I just give that as a kind of measure of patriotism, just like you saw in the trucker convoy. It's, in fact, a kind of heightened patriotism. It's not a loathing for Canada. It's a lament for what Canada has become and what it never could become. I think you'll find, if you were to ask most independence-minded Albertans, are you patriotic? They would say yes. They would sort of struggle to reconcile how they could be a monarchist or how they could love Canada's history but also want to leave it. But I put it to you that is a fact. Most Albertans who want independence are not anti-Canada at all. Here's my second point. I don't think that the independence movement is actually passionate, and I mean that in the Latin meaning. It's tortured or revved up. I think it's not emotional. If anything, it's in sorrow, not anger. It's not a rage against Canada. It's a cold-blooded, thoughtful decision that has been, lurking for a while, and now it's here. I think it's like a decision people have just finally made. I guess you could compare it in some ways to a divorce. And there are divorces where both parties argue and throw dishes, I guess. But this would be the couple that no longer argues with each other. They're just done. And now it's just having a divorce with the least rancor possible. I think that is the mindset of the average Alberta independence-minded person. They're not raging. They're not actually passionate. They've just decided. My third observation is that it's absolutely not the case with the anti-separatists, either those in Alberta or mainly those in Toronto, Ottawa, Montreal. I think in my mind of the At Issue panel, I think it's called, on CBC, where you've got Andrew Coyne and Rosemary Barton and Althea Raj and Chantal Hébert, the entire range of opinion from A to B, the entire range of geography from Toronto to Montreal. Like it's just a laugh that is their national panel. They're all in agreement, and they are raging. I mean, Andrew Coyne has lost his marbles on Donald Trump. He's got a Trump derangement syndrome, and he is now aimed at not only at Pierre Poilievre, but at any independence-minded Albertans. And so I say that whereas independence-minded Albertans are not running hot, they're very cold and thoughtful, the anti-separatists are raging. They're full of loathing. They're full of insults. In fact, it's very rare that I see an argument attempting to persuade Albertans not to go. It's normally either saying, you're stupid, you don't know this, or just plain old name calling. You know what I did? I was looking at the use of the word treasonous. That socialist pro-China Premier David Eby used the word treasonous. Other people are using the word treason.
I'd like to just take and pause a moment. I read an article last night in the Financial Times about a group of people from Alberta, I won't describe them as Albertans, who went to the White House seeking the assistance of the United States to break up our country. Now, I understand the desire to hold a referendum, to talk about the issues you want to talk about in Canada. We got free speech, that's important. But to go to a foreign country and to ask for assistance in breaking up Canada, there's an old-fashioned word for that, and that word is treason.
I had Grok, which is the Twitter-based artificial intelligence engine. I had it search through the archives of the CBC for any single occasion where the CBC called Quebec separatists treasonous, and it came up with nothing. And then I instructed it, look deeper, look harder. They could not find, the artificial intelligence could not find a single instance of the CBC calling a Quebec separatist treasonous, but they certainly ladle that word around with Albertans. And like, there's a lot of layers here. First of all, the double standard between Quebec and Alberta just confirms it in the minds of Albertans. Second of all, the fact that the CBC, a national organ under the Canadian Broadcasting Act, is so partisan is another point. And just the fact that they're accusing Albertans who are following a democratic path of being treasonous. Basically, you're not allowed to object to your position. You're not allowed to do what the Clarity Act and the Supreme Court says you can do. You're not allowed to do what Quebec has done twice. And if you dare to speak back, we're going to call you basically the worst crime in the book. My fourth observation is that when you listen to an anti-separatist, it's sort of like an ink blot test, or it's a projection maybe. They project their own sins or their own ideas onto Alberta. It's a scapegoat. I mean, usually they're anti-capitalist, anti-oil and gas, pro-Ottawa, pro-globalist. So they see Alberta, sort of like in that book, Gulliver's Travels, which is a wonderful book. And it's not just a book for kids, by the way. But remember, Gulliver went to a couple of lands. He went to Brobdingnag, where everyone was huge and he was little. And he went to Lilliput, where he was huge and everyone else was little. And, they tied him down with 1,000 little strings. That's Alberta in the minds of anti-separatists. Alberta is this giant that needs to be tied down with thousands of little strings, social license, carbon taxes, MOUs, carbon capture, tanker ban. We have this mighty giant and we have to tie him down. And everything that Alberta doesn't like, they like. It brings out their true nature. Very few, like I say, anti-separatists actually try and convince Albertans. They're not trying to make the case that Albertans are better off financially or would have a more sensible foreign policy or a more sensible immigration policy. They know that they can't make the case on the math. Or maybe they don't know and they just are going off half-cocked. But I think most of them just take it as an opportunity to virtue signal, like the at-issue panel I mentioned. Whoever can be the most anti-separatist wins, I don't know, the approval of the Laurentian elites, more money for the CBC. They demand that Alberta be submissive to whatever their ideological pet project is. They just demand it. And so they're outraged that Albertans would defy them. My fifth observation is that I don't actually think this is a bargaining chip as opposed to what Quebec often does. Now, it can be a bargaining chip when Alberta says, we have a demand. There's never an or else. I mean, or else what? What are you going to do? You and what army, right? This is the ultimate or else. It certainly has been for Quebec. Give us 3 seats out of 9 on the Supreme Court, or else. Give us control over certain federal jurisdictions like immigration, or else. Let us have our say in who gets to be a judge, or else. There's a lot of or else-ing out of Quebec. It's a bargaining chip. I really don't think that's what's on the minds of most Albertans as they sign up for this independence referendum. I mean, it could be, and it will be. The more real this independence referendum gets, the more I think some pragmatic politicians will say, oh, yikes, we better appease it. But that's not what's motivating it. It's really not. There's not a separatist industry in Alberta the same way there has been in Quebec for 2 generations. My sixth observation is that part of this independence movement is a reaction to the same thing happening over and over again, like that great movie by Bill Murray called Groundhog Day. What happened to Alberta during the social credit era, during the Great Depression, where Alberta actually went bankrupt, and the way that Alberta was treated then, and then in the 70s and 80s during the OPEC oil shocks, and then during Charlottetown Accord, and then during, again and again and again. I think that many new Albertans get to understand that when they come to Alberta. That's never taught in Ontario or Quebec, certainly not in Quebec. I think people are just sort of, they realize, there was a hope in Alberta that Pierre Poilievre could reset the country. Just like when Stephen Harper won, it reduced the demand for independence because people thought, okay, that's our guy. He's not going to favor us so much, but he's going to stop the pain. He's going to stop the attacks on us. And he sort of did, but not really. He still appointed kooky left-wing judges. He never really dealt with Alberta's over-contribution to the country, but he gave Alberta enough respect that separatism waned. I think a lot of Westerners were hoping Pierre Poilievre would do the same, but now that victory was snatched away into the jaws of defeat, I think people said, we've just seen this movie too many times before, whether it's Pierre Poilievre, Stephen Harper, Preston Manning, whomever. It's not going to get better. It's structurally broken. I think many Albertans understand that. My seventh point, I saw a little news item that a number of angry NDPers say they will leave Alberta if, well, they didn't quite say if what, if it goes independent, if they have a referendum. Now, I don't believe this. This reminds me of when Hollywood lovies say, if Donald Trump wins in 2024, we're leaving. I think the only one that left was Rosie O'Donnell and I think Ellen DeGeneres, and I think they both want to come back. Like that's two. No one's going to actually sell their house and move to where? I just don't believe it. But if it happens, win-win. I think while I don't think a lot of NDPers or other leftists would leave Alberta, although maybe some people working for the feds will, I think a lot of good people from the rest of Canada would definitely want to join. I mean, I live in Toronto, and there's an enormous number of people in Toronto who are doing what they can to get out of the city. I think it really started during COVID when the city was paralyzed by government, by public health ninnies, and a lot of people who could just relocated to Florida. That's often the laptop class, people who could work from wherever. A lot of lawyers, a lot of people in finance. I think that trend has been, for example, let me give you an example. There's been so much anti-Semitism and crime and anti-Semitic crime in Toronto that I just happen to know that an awful lot of Jewish families are looking to get out of Toronto. And they're wondering, well, do we go to Florida? Where do they go? I think that if Alberta were independent, you would see refugees from the rest of Canada. They would be probably entrepreneurial refugees. They would be people who are sick of living in extreme immigration cities like Toronto and Vancouver, probably. I wish you would see more of an exodus of the NDP socialist types, but I'm quite certain you would see an inflow of good people who have had it with life in other parts of the country. And I think that's one of the things that terrifies the anti-separatists. My eighth observation is that a lot of this is an oblique reaction to Mark Carney, not just the fact that Poilievre didn't win and Carney did. I mean, in the last year, look at Carney's conduct. I mean, his main dealing with Alberta was to have this complex memorandum of understanding where Alberta had to immediately spend money on carbon capture and jack up certain taxes, and maybe by the year 2040, a pipeline would be built. I mean, I don't think many Albertans were persuaded by that. But put aside that, just the carnival of insanity, World Economic Forum, and being an anti-American globalist, going to China and saying you're going to sign on to their new world order, being an anti-Trump agitator, doing things like recognizing Hamas-run Gaza as the state of Palestine. There's so much garbage being done in the name of Canada. And this goes to my very first point about Alberta independence. It's not really anti-Canadian or anti-patriotic. It's sort of, so Mark Carney is doing that. That is going in such a terrible direction. Oh, another $50 billion for electric vehicles. You're poking America in the eye with a Greenland consulate. You're just doing all these stupid things, corporatist thing, paternalistic gimmicks. And I think a lot of Albertans are saying, you know what? How do we separate from that guy? So when people want to separate, they want to separate from the antics and the shenanigans and that guy. It reminds me when Preston Manning wrote in the Globe and Mail that Mark Carney could be the last Prime Minister of United Canada. And I think Preston might be right. My ninth point, I think, is my most normal point. It's how would the life of an ordinary person change on a normal day in Alberta after a referendum vote or after independence? I got to say, in so many ways, nothing would change. I mean, there would still be many government services, all the ones provided by the province, which is education and healthcare. They would still be provided by the province. They would just have billions of dollars more because Alberta wouldn't be sending money for equalization or payments anymore. There are some things that would have an Alberta flag on them rather than a Canadian flag. Interestingly, this caught me by surprise when I first saw it online, the idea that people could keep their pensions and their passports. And it's true, because those things are issued to individual persons. Why and how would they change? I'm not saying that there wouldn't be an eventual change with the pension plan, but you've got a passport in your hand. It works. What does a passport do? It lets you go into another country, lets you come back from that other country. Passport doesn't have your residential address in it, by the way. It just says you're a Canadian citizen. If Alberta were to separate it, how does that void your passport? There would most likely be an Alberta passport, and you could probably, if not have both, you could move over to the Alberta passport. But just because there was a vote in a referendum, many of the things that you use wouldn't suddenly vaporize. But just stop and ask yourself, how many things do you use in a given day or a given week that are actually run by Ottawa? When I look at Ottawa, I think of taxes. I think of foolish wokeness. I think of an insane foreign policy. I think of a weak military. I really think of nothing that affects me really in a day-to-day. I get up, I get in my car, I drive my kids to school, or I drive to work. If I have to go to the hospital, none of the things that I do in real life are run from garbage collection to bylaw officers. I mean, that's real life. I mean, if Ottawa's dealing with those things, it's an invasion of Alberta's sovereignty anyways. I put it to you that most Albertans would have no difference at all in their life if Alberta were to be independent, other than they'd have lower taxes and they would be divorced from the insanity that's going on in Ottawa. My 10th thought is that some things would change, but I think that's all doable. This has all been contemplated before. In Quebec, for example, a lot of the groundwork was thought through. You may recall that Quebec elected a provincial government called the Parti Québécois. And once they were elected into office, they had all the tools of a government. They had the civil service. They had government budgets. And they studied all these things. They studied questions like passports and stamps and currency and international debt and postal unions and international flights. Like there's 100 little things and you think, oh my God, how do we handle that? Well, you handle that one at a time, and it's been done before in other places like Yugoslavia no longer exists. It's other little countries. Czechoslovakia no longer exists. The Soviet Union is a dozen countries now. These things can happen, and it's a little bit discombobulating, but it doesn't have to be a lot discombobulating. Look, Canada was an audacious idea, the second largest country in the world. But it was designed as a compromise, really, between Anglo-Protestants and French Catholics. That was a beautiful compromise where, I mean, look at our Constitution. It protects French rights in education. It didn't contemplate a large, settled, bold, independent-minded, individualistic West with more oil and gas wealth than anyone could possibly have dreamed of in the 18th or 19th centuries. And so you have a country that maybe in some ways is too big geographically. You have deep anti-Americanism that's whipped up by, I don't know, is it the descendants of United Empire loyalists, people who left the United States after George Washington kicked out the Brits? Is it really echoing from 250 years ago? I don't know, but whatever it is, I think about a lot of Albertans just don't want that. There's a deep anti-Americanism. There's political opportunism. There's rent-seeking, which is a fancy word of saying people just, wringing out Alberta like a sponge. It's all too much. If Alberta were to be independent, it would not be a disaster. And once it's possible, I think a lot of other things would be possible immediately too. From Saskatchewan, which I predict would join its sibling right away, to Quebec saying, well, hang on, can we renegotiate our position? I'll tell you one thing, there's lots to talk about in the year ahead. And we'll do that talking, and I'd like to hear from you too. Stay with us, more ahead.